I've decided I want this fabric for my binding. Now I need to figure out how wide to cut it. This measurement will be determined by the thickness of the quilt sandwich. As you can see here, I have a very thin sandwich. Didn't use a very thick batting. Other times it might be thicker. And it's also determined by your seam allowance or the width that you want your completed binding. So this gives you an example of a narrow binding, and this shows you a wider binding. I get to decide which one I like better. Generally speaking, the larger the quilt, the wider the binding, but there's nothing set in stone that says how wide your binding needs to be. You get to decide what works best for you. On this big quilt, I decided I wanted my binding to be this wide. My seam allowance is that width. With this double fold binding, both of my raw edges are hidden in this seam allowance. When I go to fold the binding to the back, like this, I'll have a nice clean edge here that I can stitch down. This binding has to hug this edge of the quilt, and there shouldn't be any extra space up in here. I've made some samples here to show you how this binding works and also to help you figure out the width that you'll need to cut your strips. I use scraps to make this small quilt sandwich here and also to cut my binding. The binding is 3 inches wide, but then I fold it, and hence the name, straight of grain double fold binding. So how do I know how wide to make my strips? I took paper like this. You could use fabric, but it's easier for me to draw on paper, and I marked a 1/2 inch seam. Then I folded that, and I placed this on my quilt sandwich. Let me bring it up a little bit closer so you can see. Lined it up with the raw edge and folded that over, and then folded that to the back. And when I got to the back, I made a mark right here, right where that fold ends up. Put that down. Now, let me unfold my paper, and that mark I'll measure. And I notice on my ruler here that ends up at 1.5 inches. Since this is double fold binding, I need to double that measurement. So 1.5 times 2 equals 3. I need to cut this strip at least 3 inches wide in order to get, on this particular fabric here and this quilt sandwich, in order to get a 1/2 inch binding. I usually like a narrower binding. That's my personal preference. So here's another sample. I used the paper, and then I came up with a 2-inch strip. I cut my binding, my strips at 2 inches, folded it over, and then added it to the quilt top. So you'll notice that I have 2 lines of stitching here. That's because the first 1/4 inch that I sewed, the binding was too wide. There was too much give, and so I decided to sew what I call a fat 1/4 inch, and which basically was just sewing about a thread over from the original one. And then when I tried my binding out, where I folded it and then folded it to the back, I noticed that it fit that seam very nicely. So sometimes, even though you've used the paper, it works best that you use a sample to help you figure out the width.